Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host, Mitch. Glad to have you here. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about Commander on a budget. Today we have an episode of Commander's 2 Cents. On episodes like these, I give you my own personal take on topics about the format in general and current news. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. And while you're at it, subscribe and review our podcast as well. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support. Today we're going to talk about the cards that are banned in Commander and why they are banned. In the Commander format, we've got access to nearly every single card in Magic's history. But there's a small list of cards that you're not allowed to use in your deck. Now, before we really jump into this discussion, I want to give a quick disclaimer. First off, Commander is a casual format, so you can play it any way you want to. That means that you and your playgroup can abide by any ban list that you want. That means that if your playgroup's completely okay with ignoring the ban list, you can do that. It also means that if your playgroup wants to ban even more cards, you can do that too. Just make sure that if you want something changed, you have that discussion with your playgroup first. You should not be going in with the expectation that every single player in your playgroup is going to agree with your thoughts on the ban list. Commander is a social format, so just talk. Secondly, I'm not going to be covering certain cards with this list. That includes any silver bordered cards from unsets, cards with a conspiracy card type, or cards that have an ante. Silver bordered cards aren't legal in pretty much any format. The conspiracy card type is specifically made for the conspiracy draft set, and playing with an ante hasn't been allowed in any kind of format for a long time. With all that said, let's get to the actual banned cards, and just a note, these cards are categorized based off of my own opinion. So I'm essentially going to be grouping them based off of my thoughts as to why I think that they are banned. The way that I group these and why I think they're banned might differ from your view, and that's okay. One final disclaimer is that just because I'm going over all these banned cards doesn't mean that I agree that they should be banned. With those disclaimers out of the way, let's jump into it. So the first category that I'm going to tackle, I'm calling Mana Matters. In this category, I'm going to go over some cards that are banned because they give either mana too fast, or too cheaply, or too much at once. The first and probably the most obvious of these is Black Lotus. Now, Black Lotus is probably the most famous Magic card of all time, and it's actually only playable in Vintage, and it's restricted there. It's also the most expensive card of all time, and that just speaks to its power level. Anyways, it's an artifact that costs 0, and you tap and you sacrifice it to add 3 mana of any one color. So this is a one-shot effect, but it's essentially 3 mana for free. That can get you off to an absurd start and get you way ahead of your opponents. In CDH, this could easily let you combo off on turn 1 with plenty of decks, I'm sure. Another brokenly good card that gives you way too much mana at once is Channel. It's a sorcery for green, and it says until end of turn, anytime you can activate a mana ability, you may pay 1 life. If you do, add colors to your mana pool. Essentially, this directly lets you exchange life for mana. So essentially in Commander, on turn 2 or even potentially turn 1 depending on the deck, you could cast this and then add 39 colors mana to your mana pool. Play all your Eldrazi, play your Blightsteel Colossus, and win from there. Obviously, this lets you too easily exchange life for mana, and that's a broken effect in many formats, especially Commander where you start with 40 life. The next banned cards in this category are the Moxen, which include Mox Emerald, Mox Jet, Mox Pearl, Mox Ruby, and Mox Sapphire. Each of these is an artifact that costs 0 and they tap for 1 color. Free mana is a very dangerous thing, especially when it sticks around. Again, these can give you a huge advantage over your opponents at the start of the game. And finally in this category, we've got Fast Bond and Tolarian Academy. Fast Bond is an enchantment for a green, and it says you may play any number of lands on each of your turns. Whenever you play a land, if it wasn't the first land you played this turn, Fast Bond deals 1 damage to you. Being able to dump all the lands out of your hand for a minimal amount of damage is absurd. If you get this card down early, it can easily put you a couple turns ahead. And then Tolarian Academy is a legendary land that taps to add blue for each artifact you control. It's easy for plenty of decks to run a ton of cheap artifacts, so this can tap for an absurd amount of mana right away. A similar card that's not banned is Gaia's Cradle, which is also very powerful, but it deals with creatures instead of artifacts, and artifacts is probably more broken. But now let's move away from mana and onto our next category, Withdrawing Dangerously. Much like ramping, card advantage is very important in Commander. So these cards either provide card advantage too quickly or too easily. First up, there's Ancestral Recall, which is an instant for a blue, and it says target player draws 3 cards. 3 cards for just 1 mana at instant speed is absolutely absurd. It's basically a treasure cruise without the delve and at instant speed. Yeah, there's definitely a reason this one's banned. Next up, there's Library of Alexandria, which is a land that can tap for a colorless or can tap to draw a card, but you can only activate this ability if you have exactly 7 cards in your hand. So because this is a land, it's basically a free slot in your deck. Sure, it won't help you fix any mana, but it's going to help you draw a ton of cards throughout the game. The requirement of being exactly 7 cards isn't too hard for a lot of decks to manage for many turns. So depending on how long a game goes, this is a free way to draw cards 5, 6, 7, 8 or more times. It's also an extremely expensive card that can fit into pretty much every single deck, and I'm not saying that that plays a role in it, but I'm not saying it doesn't. Again, these are just my opinions and my educated guesses. I'm not on the rules committee and I don't make these decisions. The final card in this category is Yawgmoth's Bargain, which is an enchantment for 4 black. It says, skip your draw step, pay 1 life, draw a card. So whereas Channel allows you to too easily exchange life for mana, this does the same but for drawing cards. But this isn't even a one-time effect, this is one that you can get over and over again. Yes, you have to skip your draw step, but that really doesn't matter since you can just at will draw a ton of cards. Once you have this down, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for your opponents to stop you with the amount of card advantage that you can get from this. But now let's move on from card advantage onto our next category, which I'm calling Extra Explosive. In this category, we're going to talk about some extra turn spells that stand above all other extra turn spells in Magic. The first is going to be Time Walk, which is a simple extra turn spell that just says, take an extra turn after this one. The thing that stands out about this sorcery, though, is that it only costs 1 and a blue. So for just 2 mana, you get an extra turn. In general, a good extra turn spell is going to cost you 5 mana and maybe even 6. So this spell essentially costs you half as much as the next best alternative. That's an extremely powerful effect, and it's pretty obvious as to why that's banned. And then the other banned extra turn card is Time Vault. It's an artifact that costs 2 and it comes into play tapped and doesn't untap during your untap step. But if you would begin a turn while Time Vault is tapped, you may skip that turn instead if you do untap Time Vault. You can then tap it to take an extra turn after this one. So it's an artifact that can tap to give you an extra turn. Yeah, that's easily abusable. Obviously, you're never going to have to skip a turn to untap it. There are plenty of other ways to untap this artifact in Commander. I think it's pretty obvious as to why this one's banned. But now let's move on from extra turns and onto our next category, which I'm calling Unleveling the Playing Field. These cards can really level the playing field a bit too much. And by leveling the playing field, I mean that in 2 ways. The first is kind of putting everything on an even keel, and the second is literally leveling the playing field, meaning getting rid of all the lands or all the other permanents, so you'll see. First up, there's Sylvan Primordial, which when it enters the battlefield for each opponent, destroy target non-creature permanent that player controls. For each permanent destroyed this way, search your library for a forest card and put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So this card that has an ETB that destroys lands on top of ramping you. If for each of those non-creature permanents you choose a land, you're going to be destroying 3 lands and getting 3. That's a 6 land swing every single time this comes into play. And in Commander, there are plenty of ways to abuse that ETB to get it over and over again. And then when Sundering Titan comes into play or leaves the battlefield, you choose land of each basic land type, then destroy those lands. So this one blows up lands when it comes into play or when it leaves. But some ways to pretty much level everything come with Balance, Sway the Stars, and Worldfire. Balance is a sorcery for 1 and a white, and it says each player chooses a number of lands he or she controls equal to the number of lands controlled by the player who controls the fewest and sacrifices the rest. Players discard cards and sacrifice creatures the same way. So this card can make everyone sacrifice most, or in some cases, all their lands, sacrifice all their creatures, and discard their entire hand for just 2 mana. Sway the Stars costs much more, but it's got a similarly brutal effect. It's a sorcery for 8 blue, and it says each player shuffles their hand, graveyard, and permanents they control into their library, then draws 7 cards. Each player's life total becomes 7. So basically, let's just all restart the game and then go to 7 life. And then Worldfire is perhaps even more brutal. It's a sorcery for 6 red, and it says exile all permanents, exile all cards from hands and graveyards. Each player's life total becomes 1. So basically, wipe everything away, start over, and everyone's life total is at 1, so whoever gets hit just dies. The Rules Committee is clearly not a fan of cards that essentially start the game over. So the final card in this category that we're going to talk about is Upheaval. It's a sorcery for 4 blue, and it says return all permanents to their owner's hands. So this doesn't necessarily start the game over since everyone gets their things back to their hand, but it pretty much does. It can also just be an I win card if you've got enough mana to float some and then cast some of those things back down to win. Speaking of I win cards, let's move on to our next category, which I'm calling I cast and I win. The first of these is Coalition Victory, which costs 3 in Wooburg, and it says you win the game if you control a land of each basic land type and a creature of each color. Essentially, if you meet those requirements, you can just cast this and just win. And there are even some cards that essentially give you all basic land types even without having to have them. And the commander for a deck that would use this would be all 5 colors as well. Next up, there's another 8 mana sorcery with Biorhythm that costs 6 green, and it says each player's life total becomes the number of creatures they control. So essentially, if someone doesn't have any creatures, they just die. So if you wrath the board, play a creature, then cast this, you win, or if someone's a Spellslinger deck, they're just going to die from this. And a final I win card that's banned is Emrakul the Aeon's Torn. It's considered by many to be the most powerful creature in Magic's history. It's a 15/15 Eldrazi that says this spell can't be countered and it costs 15 mana. It has when you cast this spell, take an extra turn for this one, flying, protection from colored spells, Annihilator 6. When Emrakul the Aeon's Torn is put into a graveyard from anywhere, its owner shuffles their graveyard into a library. So this giant death machine does a ton for you, and yes, it costs 15 mana, but in Commander, that's pretty easy to get to for a lot of decks. There are also plenty of ways to cheat it into play, and if it's in play, it's pretty much just going to end the game for you. But now let's move on to our next category, which I'm calling I cast and I win, but with an asterisk, which essentially means I cast and I essentially win. I could have just put that, but I'm just going to stick with this here, okay? So these cards might not just win you the game right away, but they basically do. First up, there's Gifts Ungiven, which is an instant for 3 and a blue. It says, search your library for up to 4 cards with different names and reveal them. Target opponent chooses 2 of those cards, put those cards into your graveyard, the rest into your hand, then shuffle your library. Basically, this is a tutor that can tutor your combo pieces or things into your graveyard that you need to combo. It's just going to let you combo out right away. For decks that are going to use this for that purpose, it pretty much doesn't matter what your opponents select, you're just going to be able to combo off no matter what. And then there's Tinker, which is a sorcery for 2 and a blue, and it says additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice an artifact, search your library for an artifact card, and put that card into the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So basically you can switch out your meaningless, low-costed artifact for a Blightsteel Colossus, or something else that's extremely deadly, out of nowhere, just really early. And the final card that I'm putting in this category is Paradox Engine. It's a legendary artifact for 5, and it says whenever you cast a spell, untap all non-land permanents you control. So this is extremely easy to combo with, but that combo can take a long time to actually go through and win you the game. You basically cast a spell, you untap your mana rocks, you cast another spell, you untap your mana rocks again, you cast another spell, and so on and so forth. It doesn't just win you the game for playing it, but it essentially does. And if it doesn't win you the game, it can just take over and make turns really long, and that's probably the reason that it's banned. And speaking of which, let's move on to our next category, which I'm calling Taking Over the Game. These are just really powerful cards that once they're out, the game kind of just revolves around them, and if they're not dealt with, you're just going to win. The first is Recurring Nightmare, which is an enchantment for 2 and a black, and it says sacrifice a creature, return Recurring Nightmare to its owner's hand, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, activates the ability the only time you could cast a sorcery. This is basically repeatable reanimation that is really easy to abuse and really hard for opponents to deal with. And of course, there are some cards that combo with this and just go infinite. Next up, there's Panoptic Mirror, which is an artifact that costs 5 and has imprint X. Tap, you may remove an instant or sorcery card with converting mana cost of X from your hand from the game. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may copy an imprinted instant or sorcery card and play the copy without paying its mana cost. There are plenty of instants and sorceries that can pretty much either stall out or just win you the game when they're copied onto this. If you keep casting Armageddon every single turn, you're just going to keep blowing up all lands and no one can recover. Or if you imprint an extra turn spell, you've just got infinite extra turns and you just win. Next up, there's Primeval Titan, which when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may search your library for up to 2 land cards and put them onto the battlefield tap, then shuffle your library. This is a very powerful card. It can just get out of control very quickly with getting you some broken lands. And then Prophet of Krufix says, untap all creatures and lands you control during each other player's untap step, and you may cast creature cards as though they had flash. So decks that want to use this essentially get 3 extra turns each time around the table. Aside from mana rocks, you're getting all of your mana back each turn, and then you can basically display creatures on your opponent's turns, so you basically are taking a lot of extra turns. Not only is this very powerful, but can also just make every single turn around the table take a very long time since you get 3 extra. But now let's move on to our next category with Cutthroat Commanders. Some commanders are just considered by the rules committee to be too powerful or perhaps too mean to play. The first is Arayo Soratami Ascendant, which has, whenever the 4th spell of a turn is played, flip Arayo Soratami Ascendant. It flips into Arayo's Essence, which says counter the first spell played by each opponent each turn. So she's very easy to flip for a deck that's built around her, and countering a spell each turn is a very brutal effect. Next up, there's Iona Shield of Emeria, which when it comes into play, you choose a color, and your opponents can't cast spells of the chosen color. Iona can essentially lock out a monocolor deck or heavily impact others. For the most part, the rules committee seems to not like cards that in their mind prevent players from playing the game. And then there's Leovold, Emissary of Tress, which says each opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn, and whenever you or a permanent you control becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. So essentially with any kind of a wheel effect, you're basically emptying your opponent's hands. Many players don't feel too good about that. Next up, there's Braid's Cabal Minion, which says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices an artifact, creature, or land. This commander is essentially a stacks piece, and the rules committee really doesn't like stacks. And finally, we've got Raphelos and Grizzlebrand. Raphelos Llanowar Emissary costs green, and it has tap, add 1 green mana to your mana pool for each forest you control. Basically, this commander can come down early and can give you a ton of mana. And then Grizzlebrand has pay 7 life, draw 7 cards. This is essentially just a creature version of Yawgmoth's Bargain, giving you cards for life. But now let's move on from commanders and on to my final category with format, faultiness. With this category, I'm going to talk about some cards that make sense in other formats, but because of the way that commander is, they're pretty broken in commander. The first is going to be the legendary land Karakas. It can tap for a white, and it can tap to return target legendary creature to its owner's hand. Commander obviously revolves around legendary creatures, so this would be pretty broken in it. You can use it to essentially bounce your commander back to your hand for essentially free, or just to freely bounce your opponent's commanders back to their hands. Again, in other formats, completely fine, but because commander revolves around legendary creatures, it's not here. Next up, there's Trade Secrets, which is a sorcery for 1 blue. It says target opponent draws 2 cards, and you draw up to 4 cards. That opponent may repeat this process as many times as they choose. So in one-on-one formats, this can make sense. Your one opponent is gaining some advantage, but they're not going to let you gain a ton. But because Commander is a multiplayer format, you can essentially make a deal with another player so that both of you essentially draw an absurd amount of cards. This can generate an absurd amount of card advantage for you and one other player and essentially get you way too far ahead of everyone else. Obviously, this wasn't designed with a multiplayer format in mind. The same can be said about Limited Resources, which is an enchantment for just a white. When Limited Resources enters the battlefield, each player chooses 5 lands they control and sacrifices the rest. Players can't play lands as long as 10 or more lands are on the battlefield. So again, in a 1v1 format, this makes sense. Both players go down to 5 lands, and essentially they can't play anymore. But in Commander, this doesn't work as intended. Limiting 4 players to a total of 10 lands is pretty absurd. And then there's Shahrazad, which is pretty much banned everywhere, and for good reason. It's a sorcery for white, and it says players play a Magic subgame using their libraries as their decks. Each player who doesn't win the subgame loses half their life rounded up. So basically it says, hey, you know this game we're playing? Let's stop playing it, and then we're going to play a separate game, but with just our library. And then if player lose that one, they lose half their life rounded up. Anyways, it's basically, hey, I've got 2 mana, let's make this game take twice as long. And 2 other cards that are pretty much banned in every format are Chaos Orb and Falling Star. Chaos Orb is an artifact that costs 2, and you pay 1 and tap it. If Chaos Orb is on the battlefield, you flip Chaos Orb onto the battlefield from a height of at least 1 foot. If Chaos Orb turns over completely at least once during the flip, destroy all non-token permanents it touches, then destroy Chaos Orb. Falling Star is a sorcery for 2 and a red, and it says flip Falling Star into the playing area from a height of at least 1 foot. Falling Star deals 3 damage to each creature it lands on. Tap all creatures dealt damage by Falling Star. If Falling Star doesn't turn over completely at least once during the flip, it has no effect. Sorry, both of those were kind of a mouthful, but essentially they both tell you to throw a card into the air, and Magic really doesn't do that anymore. And with that, we've gone through every single card that is banned in Commander. But again, Commander is a social format, so if you want to build with some of these cards for whatever reason, go ahead and talk to your playgroup and they might be okay with it. Or if there's some other cards that you want banned, talk to them as well. Commander is a format that is truly what you make of it. Anyways, with that, this show is coming to a close. So in the comments below, let me know your thoughts on the current ban list. And make sure you're following us on social media for more updates and sneak peeks on future episodes. Again, a huge thank you to my patrons who help make this show possible. I truly couldn't do any of this without your support. If you want to support this channel directly, consider becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There are even tiers where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. You can check out all the Patreon tiers and rewards at patreon.com/commandersquarters. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we're all about budget Commander. So while you're at it, go ahead and check out some of our other types of episodes. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.